The sun hung heavy over the town of Willow Creek, a merciless ball of fire that turned the single dusty street into a shimmering ribbon of heat. The buildings sagged under its weight, their weathered wood bleached nearly white by countless summers just like this one, their shadows offering little relief to anyone fool enough to be standing outside at this hour. The heat was the kind that pressed down on a man's shoulders like a physical burden, that made breathing feel like work, that turned every movement into an effort of will. But Luke Callahan was standing outside, had been since dawn broke pale and promising over the eastern hills. His vigil had stretched through the long morning hours, through the heat of midday, and now into the thick, suffocating afternoon. He stood near the hitching post in front of Mercer's General Store, one boot propped against the worn wood that had been smoothed by decades of use, his hat pulled low to shield his eyes from the glare. His lean frame cast a long shadow across the dirt, and his jaw was set in that familiar hard line that folks in town had come to recognize as his natural expression. Luke Callahan was not a man given to softness, not in his words, not in his face, and certainly not in the way he lived his life. At 32 years old, he had the weathered look of someone who had spent every one of those years working under the brutal prairie sun. His hands were calloused and scarred from rope and wire and hard labor. His face was lean and angular, tanned dark except for the pale lines at his temples where his hat usually sat. His eyes, a pale gray-green like winter sage, were the kind that saw everything and revealed nothing. The townspeople called him the Loner Rancher, though never to his face. They said it with a mixture of respect and pity, as if they could not quite decide whether his solitude was admirable or tragic. He had his cattle, his land stretching wide and lonely to the north, and his silence, which he wore like armor that nothing could penetrate. For years, those three things had been enough. The work was hard but honest, the land unforgiving but his, and the silence a companion that never disappointed him the way people so often did. But lately, something had shifted in ways Luke could not quite articulate even to himself. The evenings had grown longer, emptier, the silence less comforting and more oppressive. He would sit on his porch as the sun went down, coffee growing cold in his hands, and feel the weight of all that emptiness pressing against his chest like a stone. The house, built by his father's hands and meant to shelter a family, echoed with absence. Every room felt too large, every meal too quiet, every night too long. Running the Callahan Ranch alone had always been difficult, but now it felt impossible in ways that had nothing to do with the physical labor. He could handle the work, had been doing it since his father died 6 years ago, leaving him the land and everything that came with it. But the loneliness had begun to gnaw at him, persistent and hungry, refusing to be ignored no matter how hard he worked or how tired he made himself. That was why he had written the letter. It had taken him 3 tries, 3 separate attempts to put words to paper without sounding desperate or foolish or weak. The first attempt had been too emotional, filled with admissions he was not ready to make. The second had been too cold, reading more like a business transaction than a request for a wife. In the end, he had kept it simple, practical, straightforward. He wrote to an agency in St. Louis that he had heard about from a man at the feed store, an agency that arranged marriages for men on the frontier who needed wives and women back east who needed fresh starts. His requirements had been modest, he thought. Someone gentle, he had written in his careful, blocky script. Someone hard-working, accustomed to labor and not afraid of it. And if he was being honest, someone slim, someone who could keep up with ranch chores without complaint, someone he could imagine standing beside him without causing trouble or drawing unwanted attention. He wanted a partner, yes, but he also wanted simplicity. His life was already complicated enough. The agency had responded within a month, their letter arriving on a Tuesday that Luke remembered with perfect clarity. They had a woman, they said, who fit his requirements admirably. Her name was Clara Hastings, aged 27, and she was willing to travel west to become a rancher's wife. She was described as capable, hard-working, even-tempered, and eager for a new beginning. The letter included a small photograph, but it was faded and unclear, the image darkened with age or poor development, showing only a woman's face partially shadowed by a bonnet. Her features were indistinct, but what Luke could see suggested a pleasant enough appearance. It was enough. Luke had sent the money for her passage by return post and settled into wait, trying not to think too hard about what he was doing, about the enormous step he was taking. He told himself it was practical, sensible, the logical solution to a problem that needed solving. He did not let himself think about hope or happiness or any of those softer emotions that had no place in the hard reality of frontier life. Now, as the creak of wheels and the steady clop of hooves reached his ears, Luke straightened from his casual lean against the post. His heart, which he had thought long past such foolishness, began to hammer against his ribs in a rhythm that felt almost painful. He had been waiting all day, but somehow he was still not ready, still not prepared for whatever was about to happen. His hands felt awkward hanging at his sides, and he crossed his arms, then uncrossed them, finally settling for hooking his thumbs in his belt loops. The stagecoach rattled into town, the driver calling out to his team as he pulled them to a halt. The coach was covered in dust from the journey, its wheels creaking in protest, the horses blowing hard and flicking their ears against the flies that swarmed in the heat. A thick cloud of dust hung in the still air like a curtain, and Luke waited for it to settle, his throat suddenly dry despite the water he had drunk throughout the day. Doors to the store and saloon began to open as curious faces peered out. News traveled fast in Willow Creek, and everyone knew that Luke Callahan's mail-order bride was arriving today. It was the most interesting thing to happen in town in months, and people were not about to miss it. Within moments, a small crowd had gathered, pretending to go about their business while keeping their eyes fixed on the stagecoach. The driver climbed down and opened the door, extending his hand to help the passenger disembark. Luke held his breath, his entire body tense with anticipation and nervousness and something that might have been fear. A woman stepped down from the coach, and she was nothing, absolutely nothing like the picture he had painted in his mind during the long weeks of waiting. She was tall, nearly as tall as he was, and he was 6 feet if he was an inch. She was broad-shouldered in a way that spoke of strength rather than delicacy, her frame solid and substantial. Her traveling dress, dark blue and practical but clearly well-made, strained at the seams, pulled tight across a generous bosom and wide hips that spoke of a body built for endurance rather than ornament. Her face was round and flushed from the long journey, her cheeks pink with heat and perhaps embarrassment. Wisps of brown hair, damp with perspiration, escaped from beneath her bonnet in soft curls that framed her face. Her neck was thick, her arms substantial where they emerged from her sleeves. When she planted her feet on the ground, the wooden step groaned audibly under her weight, a sound that seemed to echo in the sudden silence that had fallen over the watching crowd. Luke blinked hard, once, twice, certain that he must be seeing things wrong, that the heat was playing tricks with his vision, that this could not possibly be the woman he had sent for. But when he opened his eyes again, she was still there, still solid and real and easily twice the size he had expected, twice the size he had imagined, twice the size of any woman he had ever considered as a potential wife. His mind raced, trying to reconcile the description in the letter with the reality standing before him. Well-built, they had said. Capable. Sturdy. Those words had seemed perfectly reasonable on paper, had suggested competence and strength without implying anything unusual. They had not prepared him for this, for the sheer substantial presence of the woman now looking around Willow Creek with nervous, hopeful eyes. Then she looked at him. Her eyes, bright blue as a summer sky and startlingly clear despite the obvious anxiety in them, found his and held steady. There was nervousness in them, yes, a flutter of fear that she tried hard to conceal. But there was also courage there, a determination that showed in the set of her jaw and the way she lifted her chin. In that moment, despite his shock and confusion and disappointment, Luke knew with absolute certainty that this was her. This was his bride. Clara Hastings had arrived. The whispers started almost immediately, rippling through the gathered townspeople like wind through wheat. Luke could hear fragments of their words, could feel their eyes crawling over Clara and then shifting to him, measuring, judging, already beginning to spin the story they would tell for weeks to come. He saw Mrs. Pritchard lean close to Mrs. Jameson, whispering behind her hand. He saw the blacksmith, Tom Reeves, elbow his apprentice and grin. He saw the smirks, the raised eyebrows, the barely concealed amusement. Clara adjusted her bonnet with hands that trembled only slightly, a gesture that Luke noticed because he had spent years watching animals and learning to read the small signs of fear and stress. Then she lifted her chin in a gesture of defiance that he recognized instinctively, that spoke of long practice. She had done this before, that gesture said. She had faced this kind of scrutiny many times and survived it every time. "Mr. Callahan," she called out, her voice softer than he expected, melodic and warm despite the nervousness that threaded through it. It was the kind of voice that could gentle a spooked horse or soothe a crying child, low and sweet and surprisingly pleasant. Luke swallowed against the sudden dryness in his throat, forced his feet to move, forced himself to step forward and acknowledge her. "Ma'am," he said, tipping his hat with mechanical politeness, falling back on the manners his mother had drilled into him as a boy. "You must be Clara." "Yes. Clara Hastings." Her smile was uncertain, nervous, but brave in a way that made something in his chest tighten uncomfortably. She was trying so hard to be proper, to make a good impression, despite the fact that she clearly knew exactly what he was thinking. "It's a pleasure to meet you at last, Mr. Callahan. Your letters were most kind." Letters. He had written her 3 letters in total, brief and practical notes about the ranch and the town and what she might expect. They had not been kind so much as informative, but he supposed in comparison to what she was probably used to receiving from men, they might have seemed generous. The formality of her words contrasted sharply with the situation, with the whispers growing louder behind them, with the weight of expectations and disappointments crashing down around both of them. Luke's mind raced, trying to figure out what to say, how to handle this situation with some measure of grace. The letter he had received from the agency had described her as well-built, capable, and sturdy. Those words had seemed perfectly reasonable on paper, had suggested exactly the kind of practical helpmate he was seeking. They had not prepared him for the reality standing before him now, for the sheer size of her, for the way she seemed to take up so much space. But he had been raised better than to be cruel, and whatever else Clara Hastings might be, she was still a woman who had traveled hundreds of miles to be here, who had left whatever life she had known to answer his advertisement. That took courage, more courage than he possessed if he was being honest with himself. She had come in good faith, trusting in his word, believing in the possibility of building a life with a stranger. The least he could do was treat her with respect. "Welcome to Willow Creek," he said, his voice gruff but not unkind. He could not quite manage warmth, not yet, but he could manage civility. "I'll fetch your trunk. You must be tired from the journey." He saw the flicker of something in her eyes then, relief maybe, or gratitude, a softening of the tension that had held her face tight. "Thank you, Mr. Callahan. I confess the journey was rather trying. The heat has been oppressive." "It's a hot summer," Luke agreed, grateful for the neutral topic. "One of the worst I can remember. No rain for near on 6 weeks now." He moved toward the back of the stagecoach where the driver was already unloading luggage. Clara's trunk was there, large and heavy, made of sturdy wood and reinforced with leather straps. It was clearly well used, scuffed and scratched from previous travels, but maintained with care. Luke hefted it onto his shoulder with practiced ease, his muscles pulling taut under his shirt. He was strong from years of ranch work, and the weight was manageable, but he was grimly aware of the eyes watching him, waiting to see what he would do next, how he would handle this unexpected situation. The crowd parted reluctantly as Luke carried the trunk toward his wagon, which he had left at the edge of the street. Clara followed him, her skirt swishing with each step, her boots stirring up small clouds of dust that hung in the still air. She kept her head high, her gaze straight ahead, refusing to acknowledge the whispers that followed in her wake like a shadow. Luke had to admire that, the dignity with which she carried herself despite knowing full well what people were saying. A small boy standing on the boardwalk, no more than 6 or 7 years old, piped up in that carrying voice that only children possess, the kind of innocent cruelty that cuts deeper than any adult insult. Pa, she's bigger than your prize bull. Is she really gonna be Mrs. Callahan? His mother's face turned scarlet as she grabbed the boy's arm and yanked him back inside the store, but the damage was done. Laughter rippled through the onlookers, some trying to stifle it behind their hands, others not bothering to hide their amusement. The sound carried clearly in the afternoon air, cruel and cutting. Clara's cheeks flushed darker, a deep red that spread down her neck, but she forced her lips into a smile, that same brave, defiant smile she had worn when she first stepped down from the coach. It was a smile that said she had heard it all before, that this was nothing new, that she would survive this just as she had survived everything else. But Luke saw the way her hands clenched in her skirts, saw the slight tremor in her shoulders, and he felt something hot and uncomfortable twist in his gut. Luke's jaw tightened until his teeth ached, his hands curling into fists where they rested on the wagon bed. He had never cared much what the town thought of him before. He had always been content to live on the edges of society, to keep to himself and his ranch. Why should he care now what these people said? But seeing Clara's brave smile as she bore their gossip, seeing the way she held herself together when she had every right to cry or rage or turn around and demand to be taken back to St. Louis, that dug deep under his skin in ways he had not anticipated. Without a word, he secured her trunk in the wagon bed, lashing it down with rope to keep it from shifting during the ride. Then he turned and offered her his hand to help her climb aboard, a simple gesture of courtesy that felt weighted with significance. Clara hesitated for just a moment, searching his face for something, perhaps trying to gauge his intentions or his character. Then she placed her hand in his, her fingers warm and surprisingly soft against his calloused palm. Her hand was large, her grip firm, but he could feel the strength in it, the hidden power beneath that gentleness. She climbed up onto the wagon seat with more grace than he had expected given her size, settling herself with a small adjustment of her skirts. Something shifted in his chest, just slightly, a door he had thought firmly closed creaking open the barest inch. He climbed up beside her, took the reins in his hands, and clicked his tongue to set the horses moving. As they pulled away from the town, he could still hear the whispers and laughter following them, could feel the weight of all those judging eyes on his back. The ride to the ranch stretched long and uncomfortable, the silence between them heavy and awkward. The wagon wheels creaked rhythmically, the horses' hooves thudded against the packed dirt road, and the prairie stretched endlessly on either side, golden and shimmering in the heat. Clara tried several times to make conversation, her voice filling the silence with questions about the cattle, about the land, about the neighbors he must have, about the town and its people. Luke answered in single words or short phrases, his responses clipped not from cruelty but from the chaos of his own thoughts. Yes, he had about 200 head of cattle. The land was good for grazing but needed careful management during dry spells like this one. His nearest neighbor was old Samuel Hendricks, 5 miles to the west. The town was small but had everything necessary, a general store, a blacksmith, a church, a saloon. His mind churned with questions he could not ask, with doubts and fears and a growing sense that he had made a terrible mistake. What had he done? He had asked for a wife, and a woman had come, exactly as promised by the agency. She seemed good from what little he could tell, seemed kind and brave and willing. But she was not the slim, dainty bride he had pictured standing beside him, sharing his life without complication. She was more, so much more, in every possible way, and he did not yet know if that was a blessing or a curse that would haunt him for the rest of his days. Clara eventually fell silent, her hands folded in her lap, her gaze fixed on the horizon. Luke wanted to say something to break the tension, to ease the awkwardness that sat between them like a physical presence, but the words would not come. He had never been good with words, had never needed to be until now. His life had been one of action, of work, of doing rather than talking. But Clara deserved better than his silence, deserved some acknowledgement of her courage in coming here, and his inability to provide it made him feel small and inadequate. As they rode, Luke found himself stealing glances at her when he thought she was not looking. Her profile was soft despite her size, her nose straight, her lips full. Her eyelashes were long and dark, casting small shadows on her flushed cheeks. There was something almost delicate about her features, something that contrasted sharply with the substantial nature of her body. She sat with good posture despite what must be exhaustion from her journey, her hands folded primly in her lap, her expression calm even though he suspected she was anything but calm inside. As the sun began its slow descent toward the western hills, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that seemed to set the prairie on fire, the Callahan Ranch came into view. It spread before them like a promise or perhaps a challenge, wide pastures dotted with cattle that lifted their heads to watch the wagon pass, a red barn standing proud and strong against the horizon, and the farmhouse itself, 2 stories of solid construction that Luke's father had built with his own hands 30 years ago when he first claimed this land. Clara gasped softly, and when Luke glanced at her, he saw that her entire face had transformed. The nervousness and careful composure had fallen away, replaced by something that looked almost like wonder. Her eyes were bright with delight, her mouth slightly open, her expression one of pure, unguarded joy. "It's beautiful," she whispered, and there was such genuine awe in her voice that Luke felt something loosen in his chest, some of the tightness easing. "Mr. Callahan, it's absolutely beautiful. I had not imagined it would be so grand." Grand. He had never thought of his ranch as grand, had never thought of it as anything but home, but hearing her say it, seeing the way she looked at his land as if it were something precious, something to be treasured rather than simply endured, made him see it differently. He looked at the familiar landscape, trying to view it through her eyes. The house stood solid and welcoming, its white paint weathered but still bright in the fading light. The porch wrapped around the front and side, offering shade and a place to sit on hot evenings. The barn was well maintained, its doors straight and true, its roof intact. The pastures were green despite the dry spell, thanks to the creek that ran through the property year-round. The land rolled gently, offering shelter from the worst of the winter winds while still providing good grazing. It was, he supposed, a good property. A beautiful property, if one had eyes to see it. "I have worked hard to keep it so," Luke said quietly, surprised by the note of pride that crept into his voice. "My father built the house and barn. I have been adding to it, improving it, trying to make it into something lasting." "You have succeeded," Clara said, her eyes still taking in every detail, as if she wanted to memorize it all. "It looks like a place where a person could build a real life, could put down roots and grow." Her words struck him in a way he had not anticipated. That was exactly what he wanted, what he had always wanted but had never quite been able to articulate. A place to build a life, to put down roots, to grow. Not just to survive but to truly live. When they reached the house, Luke helped her down from the wagon, his hand steady on her waist despite the unfamiliarity of the gesture. She was solid beneath his touch, substantial, warm and real and undeniably present. He found himself noticing not her size but the warmth of her, the way she smelled faintly of lavender and travel dust, the way her breath caught slightly as his hands circled her waist. He set her gently on the ground and stepped back, suddenly awkward again. "This is your home now," he said quietly, the words feeling strange and significant on his tongue, making it all suddenly, irrevocably real. "I hope you will find it comfortable. I know it is not what you may have been accustomed to in St. Louis." Clara clasped her hands together, holding them against her chest as if to contain her heart, which Luke imagined must be racing as fast as his own. "Thank you, Mr. Callahan. I will do my very best to be worthy of it, and of you. I promise you that I will work hard and do everything in my power to be a good wife to you." He looked at her then, really looked, past the shock and disappointment and confusion that had clouded his vision since the moment she stepped off that stagecoach. He saw the courage in her clear blue eyes, the courage it must have taken to answer an advertisement from a stranger and travel hundreds of miles into the unknown. He saw the softness in her smile despite everything she must be feeling, despite the whispers and stares and the obvious disappointment on his face that he had not been able to fully hide. He saw the determination in the set of her shoulders, the promise that she meant every word she said. And though he was not ready to admit it, not even to himself, Luke Callahan knew with absolute certainty that his life had just changed forever, in ways he could not yet begin to imagine or understand. The Callahan ranch woke early, always had and always would for as long as Luke could remember. The land demanded it, the animals required it, and Luke had never been one to lie abed when there was work to be done. Dawn was his favorite time, that quiet hour when the world was still and peaceful, when he could drink his coffee in silence and prepare himself for whatever the day might bring. The morning after Clara's arrival, he woke before dawn as usual, the habit so ingrained that he rarely needed a clock. He dressed in the dark, pulling on his work clothes by feel, then made his way downstairs, careful to be quiet so as not to wake his new bride. She must be exhausted from her journey, and he thought it only kind to let her sleep as long as she needed. He was surprised, then, to find lamplight already glowing in the kitchen, and even more surprised to find Clara already there, dressed in a simple calico dress with an apron tied around her waist, her hair braided and pinned neatly at the base of her neck. She looked up when he entered, and he saw the determination in her face, the set of her jaw that said she had made a decision during the night and intended to follow through with it no matter what. "Good morning, Mr. Callahan," she said, her voice steady and bright despite the early hour and what must have been a difficult night for her. "Morning," he muttered, his usual greeting, then stopped just inside the doorway, uncertain how to proceed. "You didn't need to rise so early. Could have taken time to settle in, to rest after your journey." "I came here to be a wife and a help to you, not a burden," Clara replied firmly, her chin lifting in that gesture he was beginning to recognize. "The sooner I learn the rhythms of this house and this ranch, the sooner I can truly be useful. I am not afraid of work, Mr. Callahan. I have been working since I was old enough to hold a broom." Luke found himself without a response to that. He had expected, if he was being honest, that she might need time to adjust, that she might even want to return to St. Louis on the next stage. The agency had made it clear that if either party was unsatisfied, arrangements could be made. He would not have blamed her for wanting to leave after yesterday, after the whispers and stares and his own obvious disappointment. But here she was, ready to work, ready to try, and he felt both grateful and guilty in equal measure. "You cook?" he asked, gesturing vaguely at the stove, which sat cold and empty. "When necessary," Clara said, and then a small smile curved her lips, softening her face. "Which means every day for the past 10 years. My mother passed when I was 17, and my father was not a man skilled in the kitchen. I learned early, and I learned well. Cooking is one thing I can promise to do competently." "Right," Luke said, then stepped aside awkwardly, pressing himself against the wall to give her room to move past him. The kitchen was not large, and with both of them in it, the space felt suddenly cramped. "Well then. Flour and lard are in that cupboard there. Eggs in the basket by the door, fresh as of yesterday evening. Salt pork is in the cold box if you want it. Coffee is in the tin on the shelf. Help yourself to whatever you need." Clara moved into the kitchen space with an ease that spoke of long practice and comfortable familiarity with the work. Her hands were quick and sure as she built up the fire in the stove, adding kindling and then larger pieces of wood with the confidence of someone who had done this thousands of times. She mixed flour and lard for biscuits, her movements efficient and practiced, her fingers working the dough with a rhythm that was almost hypnotic to watch. She hummed while she worked, a low, melodic tune that Luke did not recognize but found oddly comforting. It filled the silence that usually dominated his mornings, that heavy quiet that he had grown so accustomed to that he had forgotten what it was like to share space with another person. The sound was pleasant, domestic, speaking of comfort and home in ways that made something ache in his chest. Luke sat at the table, coffee mug wrapped in both hands, and watched her. He told himself he was simply observing, learning her ways so he would know what to expect in the days to come. But truthfully, he found himself fascinated by her competence, by the way she moved with purpose and confidence despite being in an unfamiliar kitchen, despite knowing that he was watching her every move. The kitchen had always been the most lifeless room in the house to him, a place of pure function where he prepared meals that were adequate but joyless. He cooked because he had to eat, because sustenance was necessary for work, but he took no pleasure in it. His meals were simple and repetitive, designed to fuel his body rather than satisfy any deeper need. But Clara transformed the space simply by being there, by the way she worked with purpose and skill, by the humming that filled the silence, by the delicious smells that soon began to waft through the room. The scent of baking biscuits, the sizzle of bacon in the pan, the rich aroma of fresh coffee, all of it combined to create an atmosphere that felt almost unbearably domestic, almost painfully like the home he had always imagined but never managed to create on his own. Within half an hour, breakfast was laid out before him, and Luke stared at it in something approaching disbelief. Golden biscuits, fluffy and perfect, steaming in a cloth-lined basket. Eggs cooked exactly right, the yolks still soft and rich, the whites firm but tender. Bacon crisp without being burned, each strip perfect. Fresh coffee that tasted better than anything he had managed to produce in years, strong and hot and exactly the way he liked it without him having to tell her. Clara stood near the stove, watching him with barely concealed nervousness, her hands clasped in front of her apron. She was waiting for his judgment, he realized, waiting to see if her work met his standards, if she had done well enough to please him. Luke picked up a biscuit, still hot enough that it warmed his hand, and broke it open. Steam rose from the fluffy interior, and when he took a bite, the taste was everything he could have hoped for. Light and buttery and perfect, better than any biscuit he had eaten since his mother died 10 years ago. He looked up at Clara, saw the hope and fear mingled in her expression, and felt something soften in him despite his best efforts to maintain his distance. "This is..." He started, then stopped, searching for words that seemed inadequate. "This is good. Real good. Better than good. This is the best breakfast I have had in more years than I can count. Thank you, Clara." The smile that broke across her face was like sunrise, brilliant and warm and impossible to look away from. It transformed her entirely, erasing the worry and fear and replacing it with joy that seemed to radiate from her very being. "There will be more where that came from, Mr. Callahan, if you will let me," she said, her voice bright with pleasure. "I promise you that. I may not be what you expected in many ways, but I can keep you well fed. That much I can guarantee." And in that moment, sitting in his kitchen eating the best breakfast he had had in years, watching Clara's face glow with happiness at his simple praise, Luke felt the first small crack in the wall he had built around himself, the first tiny fissure in the armor he had thought impenetrable. The days that followed established a rhythm that gradually began to feel almost natural. Luke rose before dawn and went about his work, mending fences that had sagged over the winter, checking on the cattle to ensure none were sick or injured, riding out to the far pastures to make sure none had strayed or gotten tangled in brush. The work was endless, as it always had been, but somehow it felt different now, lighter somehow, knowing that he was returning to a house where someone waited, where a meal would be ready, where lamplight glowed warm and welcoming in the windows. Clara took command of the house with quiet efficiency that impressed him more each day. She washed clothes and hung them to dry in the hot sun, the white sheets snapping in the prairie wind. She scrubbed floors until they gleamed, polished windows until they sparkled, aired out rooms that had been closed for years. She started a vegetable garden near the porch, working the soil until it was soft and ready, planting seeds she had brought with her from St. Louis, carrots and beans and tomatoes and herbs. Every evening when Luke returned from his work, he found dinner waiting, hot and delicious and far better than anything he had managed to produce for himself. Clara proved to be an excellent cook, able to make even simple ingredients taste like something special. She baked bread that was crusty on the outside and soft within, made stews that were rich and satisfying, roasted chickens until the skin was golden and crisp. But despite the domestic harmony they were establishing, despite the rhythms that were beginning to form, there was still an undercurrent of tension that neither of them could quite escape. Luke remained polite but distant, cordial but not warm. He called her Clara when he had to call her anything, but he did not engage in conversation beyond what was necessary. And Clara, for her part, seemed to accept this, seemed to understand that he needed time to adjust to this new reality. But Willow Creek was a small town, and news traveled faster than prairie fire on a windy day. Everyone knew about Luke Callahan's mail-order bride, and everyone had an opinion about her. The whispers that had started at her arrival only grew louder and more cruel as the days passed, spreading through the town like poison, touching everyone and everything. When Clara went into town for supplies a week after her arrival, walking the dusty street with her shopping list clutched in her hand and her head held high, she heard them. Women whispered behind their hands on the boardwalk, their voices carrying in the still summer air. Men chuckled and elbowed each other at the saloon entrance, their laughter loud and deliberate. The words were meant to be overheard, meant to wound. "She's big enough to eat him out of house and home, mark my words." Poor Luke Callahan, saddled with a giantess. Bet he didn't expect that when he sent for a bride. Wonder if she can even fit through the bedroom door. Probably have to cut it wider. I heard the wagon nearly broke bringing her from town. Had to reinforce the axle. The laughter that followed each comment was sharp and mean, designed to hurt. Clara felt each word like a physical blow, but she had learned long ago how to absorb such cruelty without letting it show. She walked through Mercer's general store with her head high and her expression calm, selecting flour and sugar and coffee with steady hands, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing her wounded. She had heard worse, after all. She had been called names since she was a girl, since the day she first realized that she was different from other girls her age, that she was bigger and would always be bigger, that her body was something people felt entitled to comment on, to judge, to mock. She had learned to build walls around herself, to let the words slide off like water off oiled canvas. But that did not mean they did not hurt. It only meant she had become very, very good at hiding the pain. Mr. Mercer, the store owner, was polite enough, taking her money and wrapping her purchases without comment, but she saw the way his eyes lingered on her, the way his mouth tightened with barely concealed disapproval. She thanked him quietly and left, her packages clutched to her chest, her dignity intact even if her heart was bruised. Luke heard the whispers too, of course. It was impossible not to in a town as small as Willow Creek, where everyone knew everyone else's business and gossip was the primary form of entertainment. He heard them at the feed store when he went to buy grain for the horses. He heard them at the bank when he went to make a payment on the loan his father had taken out years ago. He heard them in the barbershop where he went to get his hair trimmed, the men there falling silent when he entered and then resuming their conversation in lower tones that still carried clearly to his ears. Men he had known his entire life suddenly felt free to comment on his wife, to make jokes at her expense, to offer their condolences as if he had suffered some terrible misfortune instead of gaining a hard-working, capable partner. Tom Reeves, the blacksmith, had clapped him on the shoulder and said, "Well, Luke, at least you will never have to worry about her blowing away in a strong wind." The laughter that followed had been loud and cruel. At first, Luke said nothing. He was not a man given to explaining himself, had never felt the need to justify his choices or defend his decisions to anyone. He had never cared what the town thought of him, had been content to live on the edges of society, keeping to himself and his land. But as the days passed and the comments continued, as he saw the way Clara held herself when she returned from town, the careful neutrality of her expression that did not quite hide the hurt beneath, something began to burn in his chest, hot and fierce and impossible to ignore. One afternoon, after Clara had gone into town to mail a letter to her father and to pick up some fabric she had ordered, Luke was loading feed sacks into his wagon outside the grain store when he overheard two men talking. They were standing just around the corner, their voices loud and deliberately carrying, as if they wanted to be overheard. "Saw Callahan's bride yesterday," one of them said, and Luke recognized the voice as belonging to Ed Jameson, a rancher who owned land to the south. "Woman's built like a barn. Hell, she's bigger than a barn. Must take half his earnings just to feed her." "Poor bastard," the other agreed, and that was Henry Pritchard, whose wife was the worst gossip in town. "Bet he wishes he could send her back. Bet he's regretting that advertisement something fierce. Can you imagine being stuck with that for the rest of your life?" "Probably afraid to bed her," Jameson said with a laugh. Might get crushed. We will be finding his body under her one of these mornings. The laughter that followed was loud and harsh, echoing off the buildings. Luke's hand stilled on the feed sack he was holding. His jaw clenched so hard he heard his teeth grind together, felt the muscle jump in his cheek. For a long moment, he stood there frozen, fighting the urge to walk around that corner and plant his fist in both their faces, to make them hurt the way their words were hurting Clara, the way they were making something ugly out of something that was simply trying to be. He was not a violent man by nature. He had been in his share of fights as a young man, but he had always fought only when necessary, when there was no other choice. But in that moment, he wanted very badly to make them pay for their cruelty, to teach them that there were consequences for speaking about a good woman with such disrespect. Instead, he took a deep breath, finished loading his wagon in silence, climbed aboard, and drove to where Clara was waiting outside the post office. She stood in the shade of the building's overhang, her packages in her arms, and when she looked up at his approach, he saw the brightness in her eyes that meant she was fighting tears, though none had fallen. Her face was composed, calm, but he could read the hurt beneath it now, could see the way her shoulders were too stiff, the way her smile was too fixed. She climbed up beside him without a word, settling herself on the seat and arranging her packages in her lap. They had ridden several minutes in silence, the wagon creaking rhythmically, the horses' hooves thudding against the packed earth, when Luke finally spoke, his voice low and fierce with an emotion he did not fully understand. "You don't deserve that," he said, the words bursting out of him with surprising force. "The way they talk about you. It's not right, and you don't deserve it." Clara's hands were folded tightly in her lap, her knuckles white with the pressure. She stared straight ahead, her jaw set in that way he was learning meant she was holding back strong emotion. "I have heard worse, Mr. Callahan," she said quietly. "People have been calling me names since I was a girl. I was always bigger than the other children, always the one who stood out, who did not fit. After a time, you learn to let it roll off you like water off a duck's back." "It shouldn't have to," Luke said, and he was surprised by the heat in his own voice, the anger that pulsed beneath his words like something alive. "You shouldn't have to learn to endure cruelty. You're a good woman. A hard worker. You're kind and capable and brave. You're better than their small minds and cruel tongues, better than their judgment." Clara turned to look at him then, her blue eyes wide with surprise. Her lips parted slightly, and for a moment she seemed unable to speak. Then her expression softened, and something tender flickered across her face, something warm and grateful and deeply moved. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice thick with emotion. "That means more than you know, Mr. Callahan. More than I can properly express." Luke nodded once, sharply, then turned his attention back to the horses and the road ahead. But something had shifted between them in that moment, something significant that neither of them was quite ready to acknowledge aloud. He had defended her, had been angry on her behalf, and in doing so had revealed that he cared more than he had been willing to admit even to himself. Life on the ranch continued its steady rhythm, and gradually, almost imperceptibly, Luke and Clara grew accustomed to each other. The initial awkwardness began to fade, replaced by a comfortable familiarity that made daily life easier. She learned his habits, the small details that made him who he was. She learned that he took his coffee black and strong, that he preferred his eggs over easy, that he liked his bacon crisp but not burned. She learned that he was quiet in the mornings, needing time to wake fully before engaging in conversation, but more talkative in the evenings after the day's work was done. She learned that he had a sweet tooth, though he would never admit it, and began making pies and cakes that she left on the counter for him to discover. She learned that he loved the land with a passion that went beyond mere ownership, that he knew every acre of his property intimately, could tell stories about every fence post and water source and sheltered hollow. She learned that beneath his gruff exterior was a man capable of deep feeling, though he kept those feelings locked away as if afraid of what might happen if he let them out. Luke learned her ways too, the rhythms and patterns that defined her days. He learned the songs she hummed while working, old hymns and folk tunes from her childhood. He learned that she talked to the chickens she had acquired from Mrs. Hendricks, their nearest neighbor, giving each bird a name and treating them as if they were pets rather than livestock. He learned that she took enormous care with every task no matter how small, that she believed work worth doing was worth doing well, that she found satisfaction in simple things done properly. He learned that she was stronger than she looked, despite her size or perhaps because of it. She hauled water from the well without complaint, even in the scorching afternoon heat when the sun beat down mercilessly and the work made sweat pour down her face and back. She learned to milk the cow he kept, her hands gentle but efficient, soothing the animal with soft words and careful touches. When his best work shirt tore on a fence post, she mended it so skillfully that he could barely see where the rip had been, her stitches tiny and precise. Luke discovered that Clara was strong in ways that had nothing to do with her physical size. She had an inner strength, a resilience that came from years of enduring hardship and judgment without letting it break her spirit. She faced each day with determination and optimism that he found both admirable and puzzling. How could someone who had been treated so poorly by the world still wake each morning with hope in her heart? One evening, about 2 weeks after her arrival, a young calf got loose and tangled itself in the wire fence at the edge of the north pasture. By the time Luke found it, alerted by the animal's frightened cries, the calf was terrified, thrashing and crying, making the situation worse with every panicked movement. The wire had wrapped around its legs and was cutting into its flesh, and blood was beginning to seep from the wounds. Luke tried to calm it, approaching slowly and speaking in what he hoped was a soothing tone, but his presence only frightened the calf more. It thrashed harder, its eyes rolling white with fear, and Luke worried it would seriously injure itself before he could free it. Clara, who had followed him out when she heard the commotion from the house, stepped forward. "Let me try," she said softly, placing a gentle hand on his arm. Luke stepped back, skeptical but willing to let her attempt what he could not. Clara approached the calf slowly, making soft, soothing sounds that were almost musical, her movements careful and non-threatening. She talked to it in that gentle voice of hers, telling it everything would be fine, that she was there to help, that it was safe now and no one was going to hurt it. "There now, sweet baby," she crooned, her voice low and melodic. "You have gotten yourself into quite a predicament, haven't you? But we will get you sorted out. Just be still for me, little one. Be still and trust me." Slowly, incredibly, the calf began to calm. Its thrashing subsided to trembling, its cries quieting to small whimpers. It allowed Clara to come close enough to carefully begin untangling it from the wire, her movements patient and gentle even when the calf flinched or tried to pull away. She worked with infinite care, speaking continuously in that soothing voice, until finally the last strand of wire fell away and the calf was free. When it was done, Clara stroked its head and neck, running her hands along its body to check for injuries, her touch tender and careful. Then she stepped back and watched as it stood on shaking legs, testing each foot carefully before finally trotting off to rejoin its mother, who had been waiting anxiously nearby. Luke stared at Clara in genuine amazement, impressed in a way he had not expected to be. "You have a way with animals," he said, and it was not a question but a statement of observed fact. "I have been ranching my whole life, and I could not calm that calf. But you did it like it was nothing." Clara smiled, soft and a little sad, her eyes distant as if remembering something from long ago. "Sometimes all a creature needs is a little kindness, Mr. Callahan. A gentle touch and a soft word can work wonders that force never could. Animals know when you mean them harm and when you mean to help. They can sense fear and anger, but they can also sense compassion. I learned that a long time ago." Her words stayed with him long after they had returned to the house, echoing in his mind as he lay in bed that night staring at the ceiling. Sometimes all a creature needs is a little kindness. It was such a simple observation, but it carried depths of meaning that Luke found himself pondering. How many times had he approached a problem with force instead of gentleness? How many times had he pushed when he should have yielded, fought when he should have waited? And how much of that was because he had learned from hard experience that the world was not a gentle place, that survival required toughness, that showing softness was inviting hurt. But Clara had been hurt, had been judged and mocked and dismissed her entire life, and yet she had not become hard. She had remained gentle, kind, compassionate. She still believed in the power of tenderness, still practiced it daily with the animals and with him, though he had given her precious little reason to be tender toward him. That night, lying in his bed and staring at the ceiling, Luke found himself thinking about kindness, about gentleness, about all the ways he had been wrong in his initial judgment of Clara. He had wanted a wife who would be easy, uncomplicated, someone who would fit neatly into his life without disrupting it. Someone he could ignore when the work was done, someone who would not demand much from him emotionally. But Clara was not easy or simple. She was complex and surprising, strong and gentle in equal measure. She filled his house with warmth and life in ways he had not anticipated, ways he was only beginning to understand. She filled his thoughts too, more and more with each passing day, occupying space in his mind that he had thought reserved for matters of work and land and practical concerns. He found himself thinking about her at odd moments during the day, wondering what she was doing, whether she was happy, if she had everything she needed. He found himself looking forward to returning home in the evenings, anticipating the moment when he would walk through the door and smell whatever delicious meal she had prepared, when he would see her face light up at his arrival even though he had done nothing to deserve such a welcome. The turning point came during a storm that blew in from the west one evening in late July, arriving with little warning and tremendous fury. Luke had been watching the clouds build all afternoon, dark and ominous on the western horizon, towering thunderheads that reached high into the sky. But they had seemed far away and he had hoped they would pass to the south as storms often did during the summer, their fury spent on empty prairie rather than his land. Instead, they came roaring across the grassland with sudden violence that took him by surprise. The sky turned an eerie green-black color that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. The wind picked up until it howled like a living thing, screaming across the land and bending the grass flat. And then the rain came, not in drops but in sheets, thick and heavy, driven sideways by the gale with such force that it stung exposed skin like needles. Lightning split the sky with brilliant white cracks, followed immediately by thunder so loud it seemed to shake the very earth. The horses in the corral screamed and ran in circles, terrified by the sudden violence of the weather. The cattle in the near pasture began to mill and low anxiously, their instincts telling them to run though they had nowhere to go. "Stay inside!" Luke shouted to Clara as he ran for the barn. The doors were banging loose in the wind, slamming back and forth with enough force to tear themselves from their hinges if he did not secure them quickly. If they broke free, the animals inside would panic and scatter, and he would spend days trying to round them up again, assuming they survived the storm at all. But Clara did not stay inside. She followed him out into the driving rain, her skirts plastered against her legs within seconds, her hair whipping around her face, her bonnet torn from her head by the wind and carried away into the darkness. Together they fought their way to the barn, the wind pushing against them so hard they had to lean into it at an angle to make any progress at all, their feet sliding in the mud that was already forming. Inside the barn, the animals were terrified. The horses screamed and kicked at their stalls, their eyes rolling white with fear. The milk cow lowed in panic, pulling against her rope. The chickens Clara had been keeping in a coop at the back of the barn were making horrible sounds, their terror evident even over the roar of the storm. Luke struggled with the doors, trying to pull them closed against the wind that seemed determined to rip them from his hands. Clara ran to calm the animals, her voice somehow carrying over the storm, that same gentle, soothing tone she had used with the calf. She moved from stall to stall, touching each animal, speaking words of comfort, her presence alone seeming to reduce their panic. They were making progress, had almost gotten the doors secured with Luke holding one while Clara worked to drop the crossbar into place, when Luke heard a sound that made his blood run cold. It was a crack like a gunshot, sharp and loud even over the thunder, and when he looked up, he saw one of the main support beams beginning to split. The weight of the hay stored in the loft above, combined with the force of the wind pushing against the roof, was too much for the aging wood. The beam cracked further, splinters flying, and Luke saw with horrible clarity that it was coming down. And he was standing directly beneath it, frozen with shock, his mind blank with the sudden certainty of his own death. The beam was massive, heavy enough to crush him instantly, and he could not move fast enough to save himself. Then Clara's strong arms grabbed him and shoved hard, her hands gripping his shoulders with surprising strength. She pushed him out of the way, sending him sprawling in the hay-strewn floor, and in the same motion stepped into the space he had just vacated. The beam came crashing down, and Clara caught it against her shoulder, her face contorting with effort and pain as she braced herself against the weight. "The brace!" she screamed over the storm, her voice strained but clear. "The brace, Luke! Now!" He scrambled to his feet, his heart hammering, his hands shaking with fear and adrenaline. He grabbed the support brace from where it leaned against the wall, the backup beam he kept for exactly this kind of emergency, and shoved it into place beneath the damaged timber. Together they secured it, Clara holding the weight until Luke could get the brace properly positioned and wedged tight. When it was done, they both staggered back, gasping for breath, trembling with exertion and the aftermath of fear. The storm raged for another hour, battering the barn and house with wind and rain and hail that drummed on the roof like thousands of angry fists. But the barn held, the brace supporting the damaged beam, and the animals gradually calmed as the worst of the fury passed over them and moved on to terrorize some other part of the prairie. When the storm finally passed, leaving the world dripping and clean-smelling in its wake, the air cool for the first time in weeks, Luke and Clara emerged from the barn into the damp evening. The sun was setting behind the remnants of clouds, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that seemed almost impossible after the violence that had just passed. Everything gleamed with water, drops hanging from every surface, reflecting the fading light. Luke turned to Clara, really looking at her for the first time since the beam had fallen. In the soft evening light that filtered through the dispersing clouds, he could see her clearly. She was soaked to the skin, her dress clinging to her body, her hair hanging in wet ropes around her face. Water dripped from her nose and chin. Her chest heaved as she caught her breath. There was a dark bruise already forming on her shoulder where the beam had struck, and he knew it would be worse tomorrow, painful and ugly. But despite all of that, despite being drenched and exhausted and injured, she looked strong. She looked beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with conventional prettiness and everything to do with courage and character and heart. She looked utterly unlike anyone he had ever known, and in that moment, Luke felt something shift fundamentally inside him, something that had been holding back finally giving way. "You saved my life," he said, his voice hoarse and rough with emotion he could not contain. "That beam would have killed me. You could have died yourself, taking that weight. Clara, you saved my life." Clara laughed, though her teeth were chattering from cold and shock and delayed fear. The sound was slightly hysterical, shaky but genuine. "I reckon we saved each other, Mr. Callahan. You got that brace in place before I collapsed under the weight. That is what partners do, is it not? They help each other. They protect each other. Partners." The word hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning and possibility. It was such a simple word, but it encompassed so much. Luke reached for her hand without thinking, acting on instinct rather than logic, his fingers closing around hers. Her hand was cold and wet, trembling slightly with exhaustion, but he held it anyway, his thumb brushing across her knuckles in a gesture that was meant to comfort but that seemed to comfort him as much as her. She did not pull away. She held his hand in return, her fingers squeezing his gently, and they stood there in the fading light, hands joined, both of them alive when one or both of them could have been dead, both of them changed by what had just happened in ways neither fully understood yet. Something had fundamentally changed in that moment during the storm, something irreversible. Luke felt it in his chest, felt the last of his resistance crumbling away like a wall that had been undermined at its foundation. This woman, this brave, strong, gentle woman, had risked herself to save him without hesitation. She had come to his home as a stranger and made it truly a home. She had endured cruelty and judgment with grace and courage. And he had been a blind fool not to see her worth sooner, not to recognize the gift he had been given. The days that followed the storm carried a new gentleness between them, a tenderness that had not been there before. The near-death experience had shaken something loose in both of them, had stripped away pretense and revealed truths they had been avoiding. Luke found himself seeking out Clara's company not just at meals but throughout the day, making excuses to return to the house, to check on her injured shoulder, to ask her opinion on matters that he had always decided alone before. He found himself sitting with her on the porch in the evenings, the day's work done, watching the sun set in spectacular displays of color. They would talk about everything and nothing, their conversations ranging from the mundane details of daily life to deeper matters of hopes and dreams and fears. Clara told him about her life before coming west, and Luke found himself genuinely interested, asking questions, wanting to know more. She told him about her mother, who had died when Clara was 17, leaving her to care for her father and younger brother. She told him about her father, a clerk in a St. Louis shipping office who had never quite recovered from his wife's death, who had become distant and sad, going through the motions of life without really living. She told him about her brother, who had married and moved to Chicago, starting his own life and leaving Clara and their father alone together. "I became invisible in my own home," she said one evening, her voice soft with old pain. "My father looked at me but did not see me. He saw my mother's ghost, I think, or perhaps he saw the daughter who had failed to be what he needed. I kept house for him, cooked his meals, mended his clothes, but we barely spoke. It was a lonely life, Mr. Callahan. Lonelier than being truly alone because I was surrounded by absence rather than simply experiencing solitude." She told him about the loneliness of her life in St. Louis, about feeling like a burden to her father, about the whispers and stares that had followed her everywhere she went. She had been mocked at market, pitted at church, gossiped about at every social gathering she reluctantly attended. "I thought perhaps in a new place, with a man who had chosen me even sight unseen, I might finally be wanted," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "I thought perhaps distance would give me a fresh start, that on the frontier where life was hard and help was valued, my size might be seen as an asset rather than a flaw. But I saw your face when I stepped off that stage, Mr. Callahan. I saw the disappointment, the shock, perhaps even the dismay. And I knew that I had simply traded one kind of rejection for another." Luke flinched at the truth in her words, at the accurate reading of his initial reaction. Shame washed over him, hot and uncomfortable. "I was a fool," he said quietly, his voice rough with emotion. "I thought I knew what I wanted, what I needed. I thought I needed someone small and quiet who would not complicate my life, who would fit neatly into the space I had carved out. But I was wrong about what I needed, Clara. I was wrong about everything." He turned to look at her, needing her to see the sincerity in his face, needing her to understand. "When I wrote for a bride, I thought I was looking for someone to fill a practical need. Someone to cook and clean and help with chores. I thought I was hiring a housekeeper who came with a contract, nothing more. I did not expect to find someone who would fill the emptiness I had been carrying for so long, who would make this house feel like a home instead of just a structure where I slept and ate." He took a breath, gathering his courage to say what needed to be said. "I did not expect your strength, your courage, your kindness. I did not expect the way you handle the animals with such gentleness, the way you face cruelty with grace, the way you work from dawn until dark without complaint. I did not expect your heart, Clara, the generosity of it, the warmth. You are more than I asked for, more than I deserve, and I have been blessed by your presence in ways I cannot fully express." Tears slipped down Clara's cheeks, catching the last light of the sunset and gleaming like jewels. But she was smiling, that radiant, beautiful smile that had begun to haunt his dreams and occupy his waking thoughts. "I came here praying that you might see me, Mr. Callahan," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Really see me, not just my size or the disappointment I represent, but me. The person I am beneath this body that the world finds so objectionable. And you do, don't you? You see me now." "Yes," Luke said, and his voice was thick with all the feeling he had been holding back for weeks, all the emotion he had been afraid to acknowledge. "I see you, Clara. I see you, and you are the most remarkable woman I have ever known. You are brave and kind and strong in ways I am still discovering. You make me want to be better than I am, to be worthy of you." He reached for her hand again, that gesture that had become natural to him, his calloused fingers curling gently around hers, holding tight as if afraid she might disappear. "If you will have me, not just by contract or convenience, but by true choice, by genuine feeling, I would be honored and proud to call you my wife. Not just in name, but in truth. In my heart, where it matters most." Clara's smile grew wider even as more tears fell, and she turned her hand in his, lacing their fingers together. "Yes, Luke," she said, and it was the first time she had called him by his first name, the intimacy of it sending warmth through his chest. "1,000 times yes. I will have you, and gladly, with my whole heart and my whole being." The prairie wind swept across the land, carrying their soft laughter and mingling it with the rustle of grass and the distant call of a night bird. The stars were beginning to emerge in the darkening sky, pinpoints of light that seemed to watch over them with approval. And for the first time in more years than he could count, Luke Callahan felt truly, deeply, completely whole. The weeks that followed were the happiest Luke had known in his entire life. It was as if some dam had broken inside him, releasing feelings he had kept locked away for so long he had forgotten they existed. The work of the ranch continued as it always had, demanding and endless, but it felt different now, lighter somehow. He and Clara worked side by side whenever possible, their partnership growing stronger and more natural with each passing day. They were no longer employer and employee, no longer merely two people fulfilling the terms of a contract. They were husband and wife in truth now, partners in every sense of the word. Clara still rose early to make breakfast, still kept the house immaculate, still tended her garden and the animals. But now Luke would wake to find her humming in the kitchen and would come up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist, pressing a kiss to her neck before stealing a bite of whatever she was cooking. Clara would laugh and swat at him with her spoon, but her eyes would be warm with happiness, and Luke would feel a contentment so profound it almost frightened him. How had he lived so long without this? How had he thought solitude was enough when this partnership, this love, was so much richer and fuller than anything he had experienced alone? The townspeople still whispered, still stared, but their opinions mattered less and less to Luke. He found he could walk through Willow Creek with Clara at his side and ignore the judgmental glances, could face down the cruel comments with a steadiness born of certainty. He knew Clara's worth now, knew it in his bones, and the town's small-minded cruelty could not touch that knowledge. One day in late August, Luke took Clara into town for supplies, as had become their Saturday ritual. As they walked along the boardwalk, their hands brushing occasionally, comfortable in each other's presence, they encountered Mrs. Henderson outside the bank. She was the banker's wife, a woman known for her sharp tongue and her love of gossip, someone who had made several cutting remarks about Clara since her arrival. She looked Clara up and down with barely concealed disdain, her eyes traveling from Clara's bonnet to her boots and back again, her expression suggesting she found every inch of what she saw objectionable. "Mrs. Callahan," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness that fooled no one. "How lovely to see you. Ranch life seems to be suiting you. Though I confess I am surprised Luke's kitchen can keep up with your appetite. You look as though you have even gained weight since arriving. How remarkable." The insult was clear and deliberate, meant to wound and embarrass. Luke felt his jaw tighten, felt anger surge hot and sharp through his veins, his hands curling into fists. This woman had no right to speak to Clara this way, no right to judge or mock her. He opened his mouth to say something cutting, something that would put Mrs. Henderson firmly in her place, but before he could speak, Clara squeezed his hand gently and smiled at the older woman. "Thank you for your concern, Mrs. Henderson," Clara said, her voice pleasant and untroubled, showing no sign of the hurt the words must have caused. "I am indeed very happy here. Luke is a wonderful husband, kind and hardworking and good. I count myself blessed every single day to be his wife, to share his life and his home. I hope you are equally content in your own marriage, that you find as much joy and fulfillment as I have found." It was a masterful response, gracious and kind while still subtly turning the judgment back on the woman who had delivered it, gently suggesting that perhaps Mrs. Henderson's own life was not as happy as Clara's had become. Mrs. Henderson's face flushed an ugly red, her mouth opening and closing like a fish as she struggled to find a response. Finally, she made some excuse about needing to be elsewhere and hurried away, her dignity in tatters. Luke looked at Clara with open admiration and growing love. "You did not have to be kind to her after what she said," he told her, marveling at her grace. "You could have cut her down. Lord knows she deserved it." Clara shrugged, the gesture somehow elegant despite her size. "Responding to cruelty with more cruelty only creates more pain, Luke. It perpetuates a cycle that never ends. Besides," and here her smile grew warmer, softer, more intimate, "I have everything I want. Her opinion, her judgment, her small-minded cruelty, none of it can touch that. Let her have her petty victories if they make her feel better about her own life. I have something far more valuable." And it was true. Clara did have everything she wanted. She had a home, a real home, not just a place to sleep but a place where she belonged. She had land that stretched wide and beautiful under endless sky, land she could help tend and nurture. She had work that mattered, that made a real difference, that left her tired but satisfied at the end of each day. She had chickens that knew her voice, a garden that flourished under her care, a house that reflected her touch in every corner. And most importantly, she had a husband who saw her, truly saw her, and loved her not despite who she was but because of it. She had Luke, who looked at her as if she were precious, who touched her with tenderness, who valued her opinion and sought her company. She had found what she had been searching for her entire life, acceptance and love and a place where she truly belonged. For Luke, the transformation was equally profound. He had spent so many years alone, had convinced himself that solitude was what he wanted, that he was better off without the complications that came with letting someone into his life. He had built walls around his heart, had made himself hard and distant, had forgotten how to be soft. But Clara had proven him wrong in the best possible way. She had brought warmth to his cold house, laughter to his silent evenings, and love to his lonely heart. She had shown him that strength came in many forms, that beauty was not found in size or appearance but in spirit and courage and kindness. She had saved his life during the storm, but more than that, she had saved him from the slow death of isolation he had been living, from the gradual hardening of his heart that would have eventually made him unable to feel anything at all. One evening in early September, as summer began its slow fade into autumn, as the evening air finally carried a hint of coolness and the grasshoppers sang their nightly chorus, Luke and Clara sat together on the porch swing he had hung that afternoon. It had taken him most of the day, finding the right spot on the porch, ensuring the hooks were secure, testing it to make sure it would hold both their weights. But it had been worth it to see Clara's face light up with delight, to watch her settle onto it with a happy sigh. The sky was painted in shades of purple and gold, the sun sinking toward the horizon in one of those spectacular prairie sunsets that seemed to set the whole world on fire. The air smelled of grass and earth and the distant promise of rain that might finally break the drought. Clara's head rested on Luke's shoulder, her body pressed close to his side, and his arm was around her waist, holding her close, his hand resting on the generous curve of her hip. "Are you happy, Clara?" Luke asked quietly, needing to hear the words, needing the confirmation that what he felt was real and shared. She lifted her head to look at him, and the expression on her face was answer enough even before she spoke. Her blue eyes shone with unshed tears, but they were happy tears, tears of joy and contentment. "Happier than I ever thought possible," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I came here expecting duty and obligation, expecting to fulfill a contract and nothing more. I found love instead. I found a home, a partner, a life worth living. How could I be anything but grateful?" Luke pressed a kiss to her forehead, then her cheek, then finally her lips, soft and gentle and full of all the emotion he still struggled to put into words. When he pulled back, he looked into her eyes, seeing his own happiness reflected there. "I love you," he said, and the words that he had thought so difficult to speak came easily now, natural as breathing. "I love you, Clara Callahan, with everything I am and everything I have. You are the best thing that ever happened to me." "And I love you, Luke," she whispered back, her hand coming up to cup his cheek tenderly. "With all my heart, for all my days, I love you. Thank you for seeing me. Thank you for giving me a chance. Thank you for loving me." The prairie wind swept across the land, carrying the scent of grass and earth and the promise of rain. In the distance, cattle lowed softly as they settled in for the night. The ranch spread around them, solid and real and theirs, a testament to hard work and perseverance and hope. Luke Callahan, who had spent so many years alone, who had thought he knew what he wanted and needed, sat with his wife in his arms and his heart finally full. He had asked for a bride, and he had received so much more. He had received a partner, a companion, a love that would sustain him through all the years to come. And as the stars began to emerge in the darkening sky, as the first cool breeze of autumn whispered across the land, Luke knew with absolute certainty that he was the luckiest man alive. Clara had come to him as an unexpected gift, wrapped in a package he had not anticipated, and she had changed his life in ways he could never have imagined. The town would talk, would always talk, but it no longer mattered. What mattered was here, now, this woman in his arms, this love they had built together. What mattered was the life they would continue to build, the family they might someday have, the years stretching ahead of them full of promise and possibility. Luke tightened his arm around Clara and smiled into the gathering darkness, his heart at peace for the first time in his life.